future, we hope to have more formal activities like summer schools, summer academies, actually supervising master's thesis through this partnership of networks that we're creating throughout Africa, doing some study tours as we develop opportunities for students to engage across the region, internship programs, and visiting science programs. So there's a lot we want to build with our initiative in dealing with water, energy, food nexus issues. So let me just back up a little and talk about the situation. You're probably all familiar with this, so I'll go through it pretty fast. But obviously, there's a lot of people without power in Africa. And it's not only power at the household level, it's power for building the economic development of the country. So it's large scale power and other sources of energy. There's a lot of issues with water and sanitation, I'm sure you've heard in this course. And food and energy security is a big issue, especially globally, but mostly in Africa. And then we talk about water use. Agriculture accounts for the majority of water withdrawals from groundwater or surface water. And then we're talking about some major issues in terms of population, food production needs, and biofuel needs in the near future. So what do we have? We have scarcity issues and supply of these products and services. We're also seeing ecosystem degradation. So as we're trying to ramp up production of these energy supplies, agricultural production, water security, we're dealing with ecosystem degradation. And how do we do both well so we're not degrading the systems, but also providing the food and other resources that are needed? Issues like food price volatility is a huge issue these days. But when you look at solutions, people talk about a lot of unused land in Africa, a lot of it in Africa, but the question is it really unused and is it viable for a lot of this ramping up of production? And another important thing specifically from the Africa context is the population increase will be dramatic in Africa. Many countries are going to be in the top 10 in terms of population in the next 20, 30 years. And as that occurs, there are going to be millions of young people looking for work. And so this leads to the question of how do we provide jobs and income for these people, whether it's on farm or off farm. So some major issues. And so you've also seen these probably where water stressed countries are and the needs for water supplies to be increased by 2050. You see many of the red areas are obviously in the dry areas in North Africa, but the rest of Africa is not immune, especially Southern Africa. In terms of food production, we talked about 60–70% increase in food supply. Just think of where that production is going to come from. And you can see most of the need, especially from a climate perspective, will have to come from, and is in dire, food supplies issues are of biggest constraint in Africa, as you can see from this map. And then finally, the energy, and you can see the people without household electricity is centered on Africa and Southern Asia. So you can see by these maps how Africa stands out in terms of these water, energy, food needs. You probably also heard of this term energy poverty, and the idea is how do we shift away from some of these traditional fuels to modern fuels, and especially in Africa where people rely on fuel and charcoal for most of their cooking. It's not a question of shifting to modern fuels. That might take a lot of time in some of these rural areas. It's how to make more efficient the traditional fuels that are currently being used, but also provide the power to the communities and, as I said earlier, to the bigger economy. So there's not power outages every day and things like that, so the economy can grow. And in this context of water, energy, food nexus, I'm beginning to show you the kind of big issues we're dealing with. And one of them is producing biomass for feed or for fuel. So there's a big issue with you know, biomass, which should it be used for energy or should it be used for food? And you can see, for example, in the US and Europe where we are, a lot of the biomass or that's used is produced is actually more for fuel production, making ethanol, when Africa it's mostly for food production. Another huge issue is, attaining the yield that's needed to increase our food production. And you can see this map where there are yield gaps in terms of what could be produced and what is actually produced. And many of the countries in red are in Africa where there is a large yield gap. Obviously, in increasing the production, we need intensive production of more fertilizers or more irrigation. And you can see again where there is most of the fertilizers in the uses in the green, and you can see very little in Africa per se. And the same with irrigation. Very little blue areas are where there's irrigated land in Africa. So in talking about specifically on the food side, there's a lot of talk about ag innovations, and one of them is precision farming to do more sustainable intensification, as I mentioned, being more sustainable from an environmental perspective, but also increasing production, decreasing those yield gaps. A lot of people talk about better precision farming. With the digitization that's coming through with cell phones and things, there are opportunities for this. Conservation agriculture is another tool that's talked about a lot as a way to conserve water, be more sustainable in terms of the food production, doing things like no tillage, soil amendments, and so on to conserve the soil resources and the water resources while at the same time increasing food supply. Use of fertilizer trees, as you can see, this woman on the right here is using trees like Gliricidia, intercropping nitrogen-fixing trees which provide fertilizers. That's one of the things I work on. And so there's a move away from annual cropping to perennial cropping, which could be more sustainable from a soil perspective, and also dealing with these orphan crops that don't get as much attention in research and development in trying to improve the yields, such as this baobab seed and other even staple crops like cassava and millet haven't got the attention that wheat, rice, and maize does get. But in terms of rice, there's obviously a lot of movement around the world in rice areas to increase rice production and even breeding from a C3 plant to a C4 plant, which would obviously increase its yield if possible. There's a lot of breeding activities, GMO issues, and things like drought-tolerant maize for Africa and biofortification. So there are these innovations that are ongoing, but how successful are they at this point? So those are some of the issues. You can think about the energy, the water needs, and then scaling up food production, which is primary and requires water and energy to do. So where does this water, energy, food nexus come from in our thinking about it? Well, a lot of it comes from, and not all of it, but the Sustainable Development Goals, which was the Millennium Development Goals. And if you look at these 17 goals, you can see they're all very sector-oriented. And so the idea was, how do we connect the dots between these sectors? And there's over 100 indicators. And so the nexus was a way to think about doing that. Sorry about that. Another origin of the nexus is this food crisis in 2008. There was some work on nexus before that, but nexus is a term that means bring together. It's like fusing. It actually comes from a Latin word for fusing cells together. So there was many nexuses. When I worked at the World Bank, there was an agricultural, food, and energy nexus. It didn't have the water in it. But when there was a food crisis of 2008, 2009, there was a lot of concerns about scarcity, risk, and uncertainty, which ramped it to the next level, which brought a lot of the global leaders, and especially through the World Economic Forum and big corporations, to think about how do we deal with these scarcities. This ain't good politics, it ain't good business. So Nexus got some discussion at these large international forums, compounding that with climate change and this idea of greening and being more sustainable, reducing our carbon footprints, all gave talk to thinking about issues from a Nexus perspective. And then finally, this idea of planetary boundaries, where we're exceeding the carrying capacity in many of our resources approaches, lend itself around this time of 2008 to bringing about this idea of a formal food, water, energy nexus approach. And it is a great way to think about making solutions, because, you know, if we look in isolation, there's always going to be trade-offs, and it is compelling. And the question is it new? What's changed from before? Are we really applying Nexus in a way that helps us make better solutions? Because as I will talk about in a few minutes, it really comes down to the political policy making, decision making about how we use the Nexus to make better decisions. And obviously, when you think about water, energy, food Nexus, you think about the security aspects that's linked to it. And obviously, from a water perspective, there's terms out there about access to clean water and quantities, adequate quantities. Energy, it's all about availability and affordability. I know there is a fair, for example, in Ghana, I know there's a lot of available power, but the prices are extremely high, so no one can really afford it. And then food security, having access to meet these needs. So one of the themes in thinking about Nexus is access, availability, and affordability in terms of these resources. So obviously, as I alluded to, these are complex problems. They're not, when you think about dealing with increasing food, energy, and water by 50, 60% in the next 20 years, how do we do that and address all of these issues at the same time? It's very complex. So that's one of the objectives, is to address this complexity. But also, you know, there's a lot of definitions of Nexus. And as you'll see in a minute, there's a lot of approaches to how do we do Nexus. And I like this one that just came out from IMWI, the International Water Management Institute. It's really about, as I said, helping decision makers develop better approaches from a public acceptable perspective to reduce the risk thresholds for providing these goods and services, so we can increase and maintain acceptable levels of socioeconomic development. So that, to me, is a good objective of why we should be thinking across these sectors. So what and how of Nexus? So another formal definition, and if you remember that very first framework I talked about, of which there are many, many of them out there, all have different tweaks, but it's linking the biophysical of these resources with the social interactions between them across the landscape, across those scales. That's the basic sort of idea of Nexus, what it is. The way I like to think about it and tell people, there's no such thing as sort of a Nexus project. It's a way of thinking about how to do successful projects. It provides a framework to thinking about how to do these solutions, especially to provide that policy decision-making input. But then when you think about the framework there, so it's a tool and discourse to meet those objectives. So it's not an end in and of itself, it's a means to an end. And boiling down the essence of Nexus, we see the relationships between the three sectors, water, energy, food, and how they interact. We think about the institutions and policies around these sectors, which is really critical at very different levels, from the household all the way up to the national, international. And then how do we take those relationships and dimensions and turn it into policy actions? That's the way I think of Nexus. Now, there are many types of Nexus interactions. In fact, I would argue that almost any project you think of, maybe the ones you're doing for your master's thesis, will have a water, energy, food component to it if it has to deal with natural resources or agriculture. Because you can't grow food without the other two, and you can't deal with energy without water and food implications. But this is the classic one, the hydropower irrigation trade-off. When you're using hydropower, is there less water available for irrigation? And you can see on the left, especially in the dry areas, this is in Sudan, where they're using sprinkle irrigation to grow trees, and they're getting it from the Nile River. So how do those interactions work where the Nile is also used for hydropower? Another classic Nexus interaction is irrigation, as I mentioned, but what type of irrigation? What is the energy used? Is it hand labor or is it technical machinery? And one of the new innovations is this solar irrigation, where they pump groundwater out using solar. So that's the energy connection. And even going to the next step, there's something called agrophotovoltaics, which is a very interesting concept where you can raise the solar panels and actually grow crops underneath. So that you can see automatically, you're conserving water by less evaporation under the panels. So there's the water connection in a classic Nexus framework. There have been many models and tools of how to think about Nexus in the US and in many other countries. And you can see how it ramped up around 2010, as I mentioned, after the food crisis, it began to become of interest. In the last few years, there's been quite a few papers as reported in this good review article of the types of methods. You can also see how they vary in their scales. Many of them at this high level. As you can see in the top four, there's global, transboundary, national, region, even city, where they try and look at the nexus from this top-down perspective. And the question I raise is how does it actually influence people on the ground in the villages at the local level when you do these large-scale modeling efforts? Many of them are done with integrated models. Many of them come from the economic arena and mathematics. And they tie in, obviously, environmental management tools. Obviously, all models are a simplification of the resources. And many of these models, as I'll show you a few examples, are complex and nonlinear. And so the question is, how do they actually help policymakers make decisions? One of the problems is there's no consensus of a framework or definitions even of Nexus. So we have all these, you saw those multiple papers, over 200 types of modeling efforts in Nexus to date, and no two are really the same. They all tweak different models and they all use different approaches. So that is a problem when you're trying to make decisions and say this model is better than others. In many cases, it's very hard. Obviously, I mentioned the complexity, but how do we get the actual empirical data to show that these interconnections occur? It's quite simple to get it maybe at the local sectoral level, but when you try and intersect these sectors, getting empirical data is hard and often lacking in these models and methods. And many of the tools that have been designed, the models out there, are not really for Nexus approaches. They've either been for one sector, many times in the water sector, or as I said, in economic sectors, and they haven't really thought about how to interconnect these sectors. And some of them lack the qualitative and quantitative approaches, especially bringing the social human systems into these models. Many of them are focused on the biophysical characteristics of those water, energy, food sectors. And as I alluded to, many of them are not easy to digest in terms of policy making decisions. And then finally, the models are so centered on trying to connect the three sectors, water, energy, food, that they neglect the other important sectors like trade, transportation, or other things that obviously influence these sectors in many of these models. I'm not saying they're bad, I'm just laying out some of the shortfalls in these large-scale empirical type quantitative models. So let me just show you a few examples of approaches, and I just picked 3 places, East, West, and Southern Africa, to highlight some of the ways these models and tools are being used, for better or worse. So in Ghana and Burkina Faso, we obviously have the Volta River. There's a Nexus case study. You can find it online. It was a PhD thesis. And they raised some important Nexus questions. You know, should water be used for agriculture or for hydropower? If so, when and where? And then, you know, should the country produce more of its own production for food and energy, or should it rely more on imports? And then in terms of the policy of reducing losses in food, should it deal with water availability? And if so, what types of water availability, storage or groundwater irrigation? So some of these were the questions asked in the study. So what did they use? They used a large-scale, multispectral trade-off optimization model. So they used, you know, what are the objectives and what are the constraints to meeting and answering these types of questions. So you can see the types of, you can't really see this, but they have the different sectors there, the water sector, groundwater, electricity, food, agricultural land, and then they try to use this modeling approach, balancing the interactions and indicators across these different sectors. So what did they find? Just for example, they did find some interesting results from an optimization perspective, that they should change locations of where they thought irrigation should be because of electricity demand. So they realized, and it was a spatial model, so they could identify these places. Obviously, which is something you probably could do without the Nexus, but sharing resources and open trade across the region of West Africa would lead to obviously a large scale reduction in what their needs would be in Ghana and Burkina Faso itself. And then thermal power production would need to fill the gap in electricity supply. And they realized that they would still need food imports to compensate for the loss of food production. So that's an example of using a large-scale optimization model. Ethiopia, there was a IMWI and Stockholm Environmental Institute project, and they took the Ethiopian development goals, which you can see over here, very ambitious, large scale increasing in power production, crop productivity, and rehabilitating forests and so on. And how do they do this simultaneously? And so that's where the Nexus approach can help. And so there's the report, and what they used was sort of a network mapping. So they tried to, as you can see from the Ghana Burkina Faso example, that was very top down, just using secondary data, biophysical data. This project took a little bit of a different stand where it used the agent-based network mapping model. So it started to talk about the stakeholders involved and how do they interact and coordinate activities across these sectors at different scales. And they also wanted to see how the governance system would work in this context. So, you know, some of the results, which are sort of broad, but interesting, they need more diverse energy sources and access to technologies. And they need to really consider these trade-offs with hydropower. They were able to do detailed mapping, as you could see from their previous slide of those social networks, of the key actors and processes involved, so they could look for pathways for more sustainable irrigation and livestock and rain-fed livestock development, which is pretty big in Ethiopia. And they also were able to find evidence base for these trade-offs in terms of who benefits and who loses in terms of these end users of these products. So they were able to take sort of although they included stakeholders, they still kind of looked at this from a top-down perspective, but they did do a lot of sort of agent-based modeling to kind of come up with these solutions. So finally, an example from Southern Africa, which is this link between energy, which is the charcoal sector, which is huge in many countries in Africa, food production, and water. And there's a model called 2M Bio, and it's a systems analysis. And here again, they try to characterize each of the water sectors, the energy sector, and the food sector, and their linkages in this model, and then what the drivers and influences are. And then they were able to have this process with the systems analysis approach of defining the groups, looking at the composition so they could bring the different groups together, and then they could design interactions across these groups and at different scales. So you can see that all three of these examples, they took different approaches to develop Nexus thinking, and which one is better or worse, there's no right answer to that, but learning lessons from these shortcomings can help, and that's what I want to do in the next few slides. Here's just an example of the flows into the charcoal production from a water perspective, energy perspective, land use perspective, which obviously affects the agricultural production. So let me sort of now go to what I think is happening with Nexus and where we might want to go. So if you think about what I've talked about to date, the framings for the Nexus is coming from a technical perspective. And it's based basically on this idea that there's scarcity crisis and we need large-scale control. So you could see from at least the Ethiopian, Ghana, and Burkina Faso studies, there was talk about large-scale irrigation, hydropower, these large-scale infrastructure developments, and not as much on the ground household level thinking. The other big framing for the Nexus is, we need to deal with these externalities, these environmental problems, and be more efficient in our use of resources, the economic rationality approach. And so in summary, it needs to, the idea is the Nexus discourse need to be efficient and obviously dealing with resource scarcity. I also think it's been focused on supply side strategies, so focused on increasing production, not as much dealing with the demand side. And that's why you see these large-scale infrastructure projects. In many cases, it's been apolitical, so it thinks that it can develop these solutions without having to deal with the politics in many of these models. In fact, they're not even discussed. There's obviously this question of optimization in the sense that, when you do optimization, you come up with one answer, one number. And the question is that, how do we deal with dynamics, changes over time when you output is this one solution? And they talk about predictive tools for policy making, and that's really what it's been trying to do and make these predictions. So how successful is it? So where are we? Well, I'm not saying it's because of Nexus, but in the 5-10 years that Nexus has really been used in a lot of projects, we still have problems with degraded ecosystems, lacks of innovation and transformation in many countries, even more inequalities across the populations, you could argue. And certainly it's very clear that there's been a lack of progress in linking the Sustainable Development Goals, and that was one of the objectives of really driving the Nexus. And then also, when you do this nexus thinking, the boundaries and the extent of your analysis has not been very clear. So what's missing in my perspective, and I call these top-down approaches, you can see that not many from the examples I've given you are really addressing the local reality. And because of these high-scale, large-scale watershed basin, even regional, national, they're not looking at local concerns. And then the question is, who are they doing these studies for? These frameworks, approaches, projects, who are the target beneficiaries? And if so, it's the locals. Are they really making the decisions? And as I alluded to in a few other slides, these decisions and the allocation is really a political thinking which is missing from these frameworks. So we really need to understand the power structures and people's perception of risk, which is lacking from these models. And then the dynamics. You can't just look at these static optimization models and make decisions when things are changing so fast. And then also the cultural and institutional boundaries, which gets at these social systems, which needs to be addressed. So finally, let me just talk about alternative ways of thinking about Nexus. So we really need to do a better job, not just coordinating across water, energy, food, but across linkages of livelihoods, local resource use, and the rights and social justice of these local people. There is a lot of words being thrown out. People talk about Nexus as a buzzword, and maybe it is, but there's also this term transdisciplinary as taking it to the next step beyond interdisciplinary, which really means joint learning across all stakeholders. So it really needs to include everyone. And that's the idea, non-academics, academics, and every player in the issue that's at hand, especially some of these marginalized and excluded groups, understanding the power structures in these communities, and again, their human perceptions of risk and vulnerability is needed. And so, we need to look at the tools in these trade-offs, and it's really a political trade-off. As I've come to understand in Africa, no matter what is good for the environment or for development, it really comes down to the political will. And so, maybe there's multiple solutions. You don't have to have one answer to everything, and we could have alternatives given different circumstances. We are developing indicators for Nexus, which I can talk about at another time while you ask me questions, but many of them are static, and we need to think about more flexible indicators to see if we're making progress and making solutions. And then we need to think, obviously, across these environments and think about changes that will be occurring over time. And then think about the context specific to that culture and institution and the boundary issues therein. So finally, back to our Africa initiative. So I think I've given you a taste of what we're trying to do with our initiative and where we think of Nexus. I mean, the idea is really for us to do this transdisciplinary integrated work and be thinking about it from a Nexus perspective when we do these projects. So our consortium or network of networks as we're building with these partners, what you see here are just a few of them. I took this from the website as well. You can see the kinds of webinars we promoting and publicizing, and also we anything we can find related to the Nexus we post on the website. We have more partners in this we're building, and we want to be able to think about this really important complex problem from this integrated perspective, and we think Nexus is a great way to be thinking about that. So with that, I'll stop and open it up for questions.
question there from the beginning. Yeah, sorry.
Can you speak up?
Yeah, we already have a question from the beginning from Isaac. Is there any clear differences between One Health concept and food, water, energy nexus?
Sorry, say that again. I'm not seeing the questions. Am I supposed to be able to see them? I can't hear you.
Yeah, can you hear
You're
me
on
now?
mute. You muted
Okay.
yourself.
Yeah,
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
chat
yeah.
box below, there's a question from Isaac.
I see. Is there any clear differences between One Health concept and food, water, energy nexus? Good question, Isaac. I'm not too familiar with One Health, but I could imagine what it is. And there are many initiatives out there, and many of them might be using a nexus approach because, some people argue that health should be part of the nexus cluster. So it should be water, energy, food, health. Some people say it should be water, energy, food, climate. Some people say it should be water, energy, food, environment. So it doesn't really matter. It's just how we think about integrating these resources. So I would hope the One Health, which obviously needs improved food nutrition, water security, energy security to be healthy. I hope they include the Nexus concept and thinking in their approach.
Okay, thank you very much. To all the participants, this is the time for you to write your questions you may have for our presenter here in the chat box below. And Michael, we just wait a bit because sometimes the messages tend to um, take a bit of time to load. So let's just wait for them to write them.
Yeah, sure. While they're typing, I did give you my email at the beginning, and please feel free to reach out if you have ideas for linkages across these networks who are doing Nexus in Africa, or interested in participating in our proposal, please become a member and let me know your thinking. So, Berta, you don't have a question.
I'm just waiting for our participants to Okay. Ali said that she had some difficult to follow from this afternoon. Okay, let me.
Is that because of the internet or because I wasn't clear? Where's Ali? What country is he in? What are the models used for Nexus food? What are the parameters considered for this Nexus? Okay, Mohammed. So there are many, many models. You could do a simple model, or you could do a complex model. I mean, and as I mentioned, there's optimization models, there's simulation models, there's empirical models. Many of them come from complex mathematical interactions. Um, the parameters, well, you need to include the biophysical characteristics, so the water use, the water production, the water availability. The same with energy. You need to do measurements on the ground, whether it's at the local village level all the way up to collecting satellite data. So there's multiple approaches and methods and models and parameters that go into it. I think it would be nice to have some consistency in the parameters used and the types of models used, so it could be used across places and across people who are interested in using it. But obviously there's a local context. But I think if we have some frameworks and models that are consistent and use this bottom-up approach of inclusivity, as I ended off my talk about, I think we can be able to tweak them better and make better solutions. So the short answer is there's the review paper that I showed you had over 200 different approaches used or papers, and many of them with their own individual take on how to frame the nexus. And as you can see, many of them were these top-down sort of global regional approaches, and they really didn't answer a lot of the policy decision-making needs. And so we really need to think about alternative frameworks that provide that. And so I hope you're thinking about the types of models and parameters that should go into it. And there's obviously common ones across the any nexus thinking you would do, but then at the local level, at your specific project or question you're trying to address, I think you can add some other parameters to your approach. I like to call it approach versus a model.
See.
Okay, I see another question from what is Nexus?
I
Is
guess
that the next one?
we have one from Noah. Say we have a lot of cultural barriers in Africa. Can you throw more light on how you are specifically incorporating in the water, energy, food approach? Kindly share with us.
Yeah, so when I said there needs to be more cultural attention given to the Nexus approaches, I meant that, yeah, in each local context. So sure, every community or every country or every region has different cultures. And I think so we need to first of all look at the Nexus approaches to decision making in that cultural context. And addressing these cultural barriers, that's a political question or another question. But my thinking is if we make good decisions using a nexus approach in these cultural systems and make better decisions therein, other cultures around them will learn from that and maybe break down some of the barriers. So it's improving the objective is to improve the livelihoods and situations in specific cultures, obviously communities, but I think in so doing it can help break down these barriers. So that's what my thinking is, that the Nexus can maybe help that breaking down barriers, which is obviously a critical issue in Africa these days.
Okay, we have another question from Isaac. Is Professor Michael, what are your personal views or experience of integrating the Nexus approach in Africa? Are the leaders aware and they're willing to accept the approaches?
Good question. Yeah, so at the national level, we're seeing quite a few funding opportunities for example, in South Africa, there's funding from a national level to do this, and in other countries, I see the maybe some pressures coming from the UN, the FAO, and other places to do this integrated cross-sectoral management. A lot of the river basins have Nexus consortium or commissions. So there's a Niger commission, there's a Nile commission that work on integrated water resource management, and they more and more pressured or able to think across agriculture and energy sectors. So you see it both at a country level and also at this transboundary level by these leaders. Now the big question is, yeah, I think many people can see the wisdom in thinking across sectors because there's obviously trade-offs when you make these decisions. But the problem is many people don't want to break from their specific sector that they focused on and think integrally. So even if you're in an agricultural sector or the ministry or the water ministry or the energy ministry, there's not enough incentives right now, I think, to really do this cross-cutting integrated assessments as much as there should be. So I think there's more talk than actually trying to do this integration across the ministries. So for example, maybe there needs to be a ministry of integrated resource management, where there's actually legitimate cross-fertilization between the sectors instead of still having the ministries by themselves, but talking about integration, which they can't really do well because they're still entrenched in their specific sector. And it's very difficult. It's very difficult to get people to think about their other sectors when they have embedded invested interests in their specific sector. But that's what needs to happen.
Okay. Thank you very much. And we have another, I'm not sure if it's a question or more of a statement from Alfred, says Nexus has gone through its partners with little funding for masters and thesis studies. I don't know if you can give us some insight of funding for masters and thesis studies within the Nexus.
Yeah, so I agree. I think I encourage my students to integrate Nexus into their work. Um, I think it can only make your study richer. I realize that most of your theses are probably on specific projects. Maybe it's some type of agricultural production, maybe it's on some water system. But I think at least thinking in your methodology on approach the nexus, it can be useful um, and really understand the big picture better. And sure, I mean, I think there should be more funding for students, and that's one of the things we're trying to do with our initiative at this website and our partnerships. So any ideas you have, Alfred, I'll be happy to take them into
Thank you very
consideration.
much. Uh, Another question here is like Geraldo would like to know how water energy food nexus models tools can be used in risk management reduction in African urban area.
Yeah, that's a good question as well. I mean, I think the whole nexus approach is to reduce risks. As you saw in one of my definitions there, it's to to think about change and understand what the future is going to bring in this uncertain environment, especially climate change. We want to reduce risks, whether it be in urban or rural areas. I think it's the same to reduce the risks. And the Nexus can certainly help with that because if you just look at the water risk reduction in isolation from how it's going to influence energy production or food production, you're probably missing a lot of the inherent or neglected risk that would arise if you didn't look at it at an integrated way. So that's all I'm saying is if you're looking at risk reduction in urban setting in just one of these sectors, you're missing the risk impacts from the other sectors, which might be a very negative trade-off. And so looking at it in this integrated way, I think can help reduce risk.
Thank you very much. And for now, we have a last question from Ramatu. Um, what contribution the alternative nexus can give to African country in a way of development?
Um,
Um,
so I've sort of answered though.
Yeah,
Can you
let me
repeat
see.
it?
I'm trying to
What's the, how
figure
can
out what he meant with this. It's
Nexus?
like, what contribution does the alternative Nexus could give to African countries in to help them in their development? I believe he's meaning.
Yeah, well, I think, if you're talking about my last slides on alternative approaches, you can see that the historical trajectory of Nexus has been these top-down, large-scale modeling events where they've neglected to include a lot of the local people in the process, communities, really understanding their needs. And so developing it from the bottom up. And I think solutions to Africa's problems nearly need to start at that local level. That's where livelihoods are dependent on, water, energy, food, more than at a national level, so to speak, although it trickles up to that national level. So I think it's the Nexus approach, this alternative approach where it's more inclusive, and we look at it really from a policy perspective from the beginning. What are the policy objectives? Instead of thinking that as an afterthought after you do the model, I think can really help development in Africa if it's done properly and there's a political will to see that happen, where all the players are included in this process.
Okay, thank you very much. If there are more questions for the participants, please write them in the chat box below. I see there are more people writing. Let's just wait for them to finish their questions.
Sure.
And let me remind to all that the material provided from Dr. Jacobson is going to be available in your e-learning platform, as well as his contact. He already told you that he is open for collaboration, and if you want to approach him, just reach out. We have here more questions. Is water, energy, food nexus approach really a holistic approach?
Absolutely. Well, I think, there's many other resources that you can think about, that influence, and services that influence development. But, you know, if you can include water, energy, food in an integrated, holistic approach, I think you're going a long way to making better solutions. So I would argue that it does try to encompass all the things that are necessary. People can't live without water, energy, food. So that's the basis for that approach. And sure, if you have a decent framework, you can include all the other resources, services, drivers, influences into this context. So I would argue yes, um, because these are the primary resources for livelihoods.
Okay, thank you very much. And I guess I forgot, I missed one question from Thierry above. He said how the Nexus approach can be used to address energy challenges in Africa, especially energy access, or what should be the way of thinking as a scientist standpoint?
Yes, obviously energy access is critical, as you saw from my maps and the evidence that many people don't have access to electricity. Many people are still cooking with wood and charcoal. Not that that's bad. I think that's still an important resources that shouldn't be neglected. The alternatives are fossil fuels, which might be worse in many cases. The question is how to make energy availability and access more affordable, especially in the cities where I know power is very expensive. Um, but I think the way to think about it is what is your energy interest? So, for example, from that charcoal uh, study, if it's charcoal or fuel wood, then you think about, okay, where are they getting those resources? Um, what is the influence of the harvesting of those woody species for charcoal or fuel wood having on food production? What is the labor to be involved in collecting these resources? And then from, when you're thinking about water, you think about, so there's the food connection with the charcoal production, but also in the cooking and uh, the conversion of these energy products, is water influenced in that as well. So I think, that's one example. There's a lot of interest in solar. And so what are the alternatives? If you go towards more solar power, these micro grids in communities where they're providing power versus other sources of power, you can look at the trade-offs there from the water and the food production perspectives, because if you're going to put a solar project into a community, you're obviously affecting the other resources, maybe for better or for worse, but you need to look at it in that context. So I think the answer, Terry, is to look at it. What is the specific energy issue you're really thinking about? What are the questions you want to address? And then does a Nexus framework help you answer those questions?
Okay, thank you very much. I guess Thierry is working his answer for to start discussion, but we also have here a discussion point from Abu Bakar. He's mentioned that in Sub-Saharan Africa countries especially, there are a lot to do. Indeed, there is most often conflicts because there is no clear institutional framework for the institutions dealing with, for instance, water, energy, mine, and food or agricultural domain. So there's a huge need to set a clear institutional framework as well as the eventual interrelations in order to make the Nexus approach work at the policy making level.
Yeah, that's a good statement. And I don't know if there's a question in there, but I would totally agree that this institutional framework, the surrounding policy governance, are sort of, people put that as a framework around the biophysical characteristics of water, energy, food. But as I tried to say, that should probably be the central issue: is these policies dimensions, and then therein we can look at the biophysical characteristics of these systems. So ignoring the institutional framework is it's a critical piece of the puzzle. And 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 sure, there's shortcomings in Africa in these institutional frameworks. I don't have the answer for those, but that's really political situations in many cases. But one of the examples I think that could help is if the government's committed to thinking integratively across these sectors, and having the ministers and their people really committed to working across these ministries, departments, I think can go a long way in providing incentives to allow this integration to happen.
Yep. Totally agree, and thank you, Dr. Jacobson, and thank you, Abu Bakar, for that insightful statement. I saw that Thierry was writing regarding the previous question. Thierry, do you still have a more specific question? Or does anybody has more questions for Dr. Jacobson? Okay, yeah,
Yeah, how to collaborate. So yeah, we want to collaborate. That's the whole point of our initiative, and we want to have partners like you in Africa who want to work on these questions. So you need to become a member of our initiative, first of all, and then you need to email me about your project interests and how we can perhaps find funding and what are the opportunities to collaborate across your institutions, to get these partnerships going. Because I think, no one's an expert in any of these sectors, so we need to work across and have multiple teams where we're working together. So we look forward to collaboration, and we want the ideas to come from you guys. So when you say how to collaborate, okay, what do you want to collaborate on? And then we can use our resources with this Africa partnership to help make it happen.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much. And yeah, I believe the first step to collaborate is this kind of events, such as the summer school, where we can connect people who are interested in these projects, like the students to you, to, for example, our presenter today that has make himself available for cooperation. So if you're really interested in collaborate, just reach out. We have more questions.
Sure.
Okay, there is another one. Do you deal with water energy land use?
Yeah. I think it's another nuance. It's terminology. It's semantics. So land use. Yeah. I mean, I'm a forester by training, right? Why isn't forestry in the Nexus? Why don't we add forestry? So I look at land use as, or food as a proxy for land use, but I agree. I mean, I think the land use is the overall concept of where we get our water, energy, food next from, and, other than the solar, all the other land uses provide energy. So it's the boundary, it's the condition. But when you think about it, it's the food, energy, water, which are the essential elements for livelihood. So yeah, I mean, you can replace food with land use, but that's broader. But we don't want to neglect all the other land uses that, forests provide food. A lot of other land uses, pastoral systems provide food, livestock. So think about it from that perspective. And it doesn't really matter as long as you're thinking integratively in a Nexus approach. The ways you connect these resources is secondary to thinking across these and integrating them.
Okay. There's another
What approach?
question. What what approach from Hawa? What Nexus approach the African people must use to resolve the problem of urbanization and water?
Okay, that's a very specific question. Obviously, water is needed in cities, and there's the whole water sanitation issue, wastewater treatment. I mean, here in the US, how to recycle wastewater. I mean, there's a lot of interest in using wastewater for irrigating crops. So there's the linkage with food. And then obviously, when you're having water systems in urban areas, there's the energy context. What is it coming from? Hydropower? Is it, where's the water coming from? And what's the energy use in the collection? I know in many cities in Africa, there's still people who have to go to outside taps to collect buckets of water. So that's labor, that's energy as well. So have we ever thought about the energy used in the human labor context, not only in the infrastructural energy? So, so yeah, the nexus can be used to be thinking about those problems.
Thank you very much. And we have the more specific question from Thierry. That before he asked you about specific part of the nexus with energy, now he specified that the source he's interested in is solar PV. And what I have seen in many projects so far, it is like they're focused on one dimension, only providing power without looking at the other aspects like water.
Yeah, and that's what I've been trying to say. I thought my slide on the solar irrigation was a good example where we can get solar used both for power and irrigation if you do your systems correctly. And then if you even take it to the next step, you can do this agrophotovoltaics where you've got your crops integrated into the solar panel perspective. So solar is very important for especially rural communities that don't have access to power. So that could be the primary perspective. But I think, and you can even look at it in a positive way. So when they do get this power from solar, even if, what are the impacts on their health, on their food production? Does it change? And you can look at it from that perspective as well to show that there are those nexus connections. Um, so I agree with you. There needs to be more integration in solar and how it affects these other sectors. It could be positive trade-offs or negative trade-offs.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we have another from Yael, a different one from the ones we had before. I would like to know how the Nexus approach is financed and
Okay. Well, there's finance coming from the development banks and some of those larger donor institutions to fund some of these transboundary commissions I mentioned, where obviously there's the water resource issues. So, for example, the Ethiopia dams, Egypt, issues on the Volta River, the Niger River, Zambezi River. And so these are larger scale national, international issues where they're getting funding from that perspective. And then there's interest in some of the foundations, but we need to do a better job of finding these resources. And I think that's a challenge. Some of the research institutions are funding some of these nexus models, but how they reach the policymakers is another story. So I think we and Joel, this is where you can help is where can we get more innovative financing? I think one of the reasons is the world banks and the development institutions, they like to see specific large-scale infrastructure problems like a hydropower or a big solar irrigation project, and then they don't look at the nexus issues when they bring these large-scale projects. As I was mentioning, they're interested in these large-scale projects to deal with economic problems, and they think it's economically feasible, efficient to do these things without thinking about the impacts on the ground. So they haven't really thought about these projects in a nexus context. And that's where we need to find funding to be able to look at it in that context. There's nothing wrong with funding an individual hydropower project or a specific food production project or an energy project, but there's the lack of funding to do it in an integrative way that we need to find resources for.
I believe we have another question from Ali Badara. I'm also interested to know about the collaboration in water, energy, food, Nexus projects. I mean, like PhD.
Yeah. Yeah, well, reach out to me. I mean, I think there's funding is obviously an issue, but I think if, as I said before, there is the WEF Nexus, there's no WEF Nexus project. It's a project that uses a Nexus approach, Nexus thinking. So what is the project? Is it solar, charcoal, irrigation? What is the issue you're trying to solve and looking at it in a Nexus context? That's the way I like to think about it. And so if you're interested in using Nexus in your research questions, that's the way to go. And I think through our partnership, I think we're going to be developing examples where people see the worth of doing this. And so I think there'll be more PhD research opportunities to using a clear Nexus thinking. For example, I have a PhD student right now who's working in Zambia on aquaculture and trees. So fish farming, integrating trees as fertilizer with the leaves, but he's looking at it as in a nexus context and how he can help the community livelihoods from this perspective and the trade-offs with the fish farming and agroforestry systems. What are the impacts on the water, energy, food systems in general? So that's how you can integrate it into a specific research project, for example.
Thank you very much. And yeah, Dr. Jacobson is right. He's reaching out with you. He's giving you your contact. So please take this opportunity to share with him your ideas and your questions. So to the rest of the participants, do you have any more questions? We still have a couple of minutes to go. Address the chat box below.
As you can see, we are working with UNU, and I want to thank him again for inviting me. But yeah, so we can work through their system as well um, to work on these ideas and interest in PhD that you have.
For sure, and I'm sure that also here at the team we are able to guide you a little bit if you a topic PhD research.
But again, the idea, the topic, the interest, the idea has to come from you. It has to be like what you want to work on, and then we can find ways to do it. It can't come from me, and it has to be a need from your end.
Okay, I guess nobody's okay. Yeah, they're ready. It is okay. Salimata's okay. She was making question from somebody else. Yeah, it's okay. Still, the answer is valid. I guess, and you can transfer to her the answers.
Yeah,
No sound. I hope just a
yeah.
few,
I
not the whole
think some people.
webinar. Okay, okay. Uh,
All right.
yeah, no problem. You can join
And after people
together
listen
or in the
to it,
groups. Yeah, there's no problem with that.
if they couldn't watch it now, they can still email me questions or anything, or through you. And you can
They,
or whatever you want to do.
yeah, for sure. And for sure, and the webinar, as all of the other webinars, will be available in your e-learning platform soon, and also Dr. Jacobson's presentation, and there is his contact too. So it is not just this webinar at this time of the day. You can access it anytime, and also his contact. So you can, if you have more questions, you can address them to him. Ali Badaga, yeah, thank you. We take a note that Salemat is also with you, so she will also had attendance to this webinar. So okay, she did not get the answers. For what question exactly? Was about the PhD? I guess for the PhD question was really clear. Just reach out with your idea, and yeah, okay. Do you know specifically what part did you
There's a
get
question about what do you
about
think about the
the
conflict of
Dr.
land
Jacobson's
and
answer?
energy in Nexus perspective? Okay, that's a big question, Terry. But for example, what specific conflict? So obviously, remember one of my slides was the food versus fuel conflict, and should we be growing um, food for animals or for biomass or for food? That's the trade-off. So and as I mentioned, in the U.S., a lot of our food production, our corn, our maize, is used for animal feed and for fuel. And so is that a good use of our land resources? Should, and in the context of Africa, most of the food is used for, I mean, most of the production of is used for food, but could there be more production of fuels from the land use to scale up energy resources? I think biofuels are an important resources, but obviously they take up a lot of land. And so what's the trade-off there, for example? And as livestock increases in many of African countries, they're going to need more feed, more pasture land. What's the trade-off on that land for crop production? So those are examples from a Nexus perspective.
Okay, thank you very much. I see there are no more questions. I guess to Ali Badaga, we answer it, I believe. Dr. Jacobson is basically reach out with your own idea, and if you want to have a next approach, just contact him, and I guess you
I'm
can work
happy
something
to.
together.
I'd like to see a lot more PhDs and students working in the Nexus. So anything I can do to help will be great. Working through your institution or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sir Thierry says thank you. So I don't see anyone else writing. Is there anyone wants to ask a question? Okay. I don't see anybody else typing anymore. Okay, yeah, the professor email address is in his presentation, and we will make it available to you as well as the webinar, so you can access it. I'm just gonna go back to the first slide so you can see it. There is his email address in the first slide of his presentation. As I tell you, you can also get it online on your e-learning platform. Isaac is still writing something. Okay, we're really close to closing the webinar. While we wait for Isaac, if he has a question, let's start wrapping up the webinar. First of all, thank you very much, Dr. Jacobson, for your presentation. In name of all of our students, the organization team from the summer school, and the whole RARSUS project. Thank you very much. It was really interesting, and of course, thank you for engaging so much with the students at the end.
Okay. You're very
I guess
welcome. Thanks
you
for
gave
joining.
more time to their questions and the
And thanks for the
discussion, and
opportunity.
I really believe they appreciate it a lot. Okay, I guess just the last question.
Ah, so Isaac, yeah, I'm going to be in Ghana in next year at Legon, but for a few months. But I need to know more specifics. That's such a big question. How, what's the context? What's the area? and so we can talk about it. Be happy to.
Okay. So I believe you are just the time mark. So you have his contact. If you have further questions or want to collaborate more with him, just send him an email. So Professor, that's it for the webinar. Thank you again, and you can log out of the room